How many of you have seen the new Star Wars movie? How many of you liked it? By the way, I knew Jackie was a volleyball player. I just didn't know that she'd resort to carrying the ball around with her. Yeah, I thought it was an okay movie. I thought it was entertaining. There have been some great movies, some great scenes in movies. Anybody have a particular scene in a movie that they liked a lot? Think of one? Nobody? Hello? Yes, thank you. What movie was that? Inside Out. Inside, I've not seen that. Sounds good. Thank you, sweetie. Well, one of my favorite scenes, I chickened out on showing you this morning. Crescent has it already, but I'm going to describe it to you instead of telling you to see it. Just kind of, it's a scene from Psycho. The shower scene from Psycho. Yeah, see, I chickened out. How many of you have not seen that scene? Okay, the shower scene from Psycho shows, what was her name? Janet Leigh. Going into the shower, it's in black and white, closing the shower curtain. And she's taking a lovely shower. Her hair is getting wet. And then all of a sudden this music starts. And it's this intense music. And you see a shadow come. You're inside the shower with Janet, and you see the shadow on the other side of the screen, of the curtain. And it rips the curtain open, and this knife starts descending over and over and over. No, that's why, yeah, I kind of chickened out. But anyway, this movie changed the entire generation's perspective on taking showers. You hear the awful screechy music, you feel the helplessness and the horror of being cocooned in rushing warm water, you shiver at the coming of the unexpected life-extinguishing knife. Now, you never see any violence. You never see the knife impacting the person. The movie's so scary because everything is masterfully implied. Signs and images. The camera goes to the drain, and you see the water turn dark. Of course, since it's in black and white, they use chocolate syrup, apparently, to simulate the blood. But the movie changed the entire filmmaking industry. Do you know that? Do you know why? Before Psycho, movie theaters ran their movies on a continuous loop, back to back, repeating the movie over and over without a break. There were no scheduled times for movies. The film itself was on a looping reel that went round and round without a pause. So the movie experience was on a looping wheel that went round and round as well. Film viewers came and went at their leisure. There were no lines to get in the movie, no starting and ending time. You could enter the theater at any time and leave when the movie looped back to where they had started. Now, this practice is what led to this phrase, "This is where we came in." This is where we came in. And you didn't know where that came from, did you? This is where we came in. You always wondered what that meant. Hitchcock was a genius. He didn't want audiences to find out who the mysterious reality of his psycho person was. Until they had progressed step by step through the terror-building tension. He also didn't want the problem of late-coming goers wondering for much of the movie how come the marquee star Janet Leigh had not made an appearance yet. Yeah. And so the movie was the first one that he insisted have a set starting time and set ending time. Alfred Hitchcock forced all the theaters playing his movie to have set times and then empty the theater before the next show began, so that they wouldn't spoil the surprise. And for the first time, you could be late for a movie, all thanks to Alfred Hitchcock. Has nothing to do with our sermon this morning. Just a little bit. But that's where the whole concept of this is where we came in originated. Beginnings are important. Set beginnings are important. Defining the moment of a beginning was something both Hitchcock and our gospel writer John had in common. The beginning words and the beginning scenes that they chose had to have the enduring power, the enduring presence to carry on throughout the whole story. It was the first public expression of power contained in his word in our gospel story today. Because John's story was focused on nothing less than establishing the very beginning by saying, in the beginning was the Word. I mean, he starts it right. There's no doubt where John is starting his story. And then we come to the wedding party at Cana, which is the first public expression of the power that Christ was, that Christ represented on earth. First ministry, beginning of his 3 years of ministry on earth. A wedding in Cana. What could be more happy, more exciting, and yet more common than a wedding? People get married every day. I think between my son and I, we've married half of them.
Yeah.
And yet this wedding in Cana was a once in a lifetime event. Once in a creation event. The wedding day in Cana in Galilee was to be the most memorable wedding ever, because it was the first event in a completely new era. For this wedding, according to the divine script and direction, this is where we came in. This wedding is where we come in for a whole new life, folks. This is where it all really started for us. This wedding is a definite beginning of a new time, with new prospects, new possibilities, new life. Jesus' final hour was not yet, that was 3 years to come. But with an act as simple as pouring out a glass of wine, this beginning of his signs, Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and what happened? His disciples believed. This, of course, was the beginning of Jesus' ministry on earth. This is truly where he and where we came in. Jesus' final hour is revealed later, but here, this wine, pressed together and poured out for others, revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. How do you make wine? You take grapes, individual grapes, and you crush them. You take individual grapes side by side, and you crush them, and their juice mingles. It's kind of like how he makes the church. He takes individual lives, and he allows those lives to go through a painful, crushing process at times. We all have encountered the times in our lives when we thought, when is the pain going to ease up? But the mingling of that together creates a very sweet vintage. 3 years later, as Jesus' final hour approached, he again would pour out wine, even as he prepared to pour out his own life for others. In a borrowed room, Jesus gathered his disciples together to celebrate the Passover, a meal that would, in Christian terms, become the Last Supper. And as Jesus shared the bread and wine with his companions, he declared this. He said, "This is my body broken for you, and this is my blood of the new covenant shed for you, poured out for you." You know, there's a lot in this world that we live in that's broken. A lot. Relationships are broken. Lives are broken. We are broken by our fears. We are broken by our hatreds. We are broken by our selfishness. We are broken by our inability or our unwillingness to love and to forgive. And there's only one way to bring health and wholeness back into broken lives. As Jesus showed us so clearly at his first hour and at his final hour. We must live our lives poured out for others. You know what happens when wine sits around too long? It turns sour. Even the best wine turns to vinegar. Sour, worthless, completely unpalatable. A life that is not poured out for others. A life that is not given in service and love to others. A life lived for self and self alone. That life sours. Life cannot be hoarded or stockpiled by oneself or for oneself. You know that hoarding is now recognized as a distinct behavioral disorder. Hoarders cannot bring themselves to get rid of anything. They can't throw away trash. They can't recycle old newspapers or magazines. Hoarders cannot part with anything once it comes into their orbit. The hoarder's whole identity is identified or defined by the growing stacks of stuff in their arms. And here's the sour part. The fuller the space becomes, the emptier their lives grow. Instead of relationships, a career, a home, a purpose, hoarders have nothing except piles and piles of stuff. Trash. Even if that trash is cash. Pour yourself out. Pour yourself out into your work. Pour yourself out into your family. Pour yourself out into your church. Pour yourself out into your community. Pour yourself out into this world that God loved so much that he sent Jesus to die for. Pour yourself out just as Christ poured himself, his very life for each one of us. Anyone here ever seen the Dead Sea? George, I know you have. Anyone else? Got the sea? Anyone know here, besides you three, why it's called the Dead Sea? Because it's dead. I mean, I think, I'm not a brain surgeon, but I think that makes sense. They call it the Dead Sea simply, right, because it's dead. And do you know why it's dead? Because it's the lowest piece of property on God's green earth. It sits 429 meters, or 1,407 feet below sea level. It's the lowest place on the planet. Do you know, by the way, that the Dead Sea is also almost 1,000 foot deep?
Really?
Yeah. It's dead because it's so low down. It's dead because it does nothing but receive. It does nothing but gather in. Waters flow into it. The Jordan River is its main tributary that feeds the Dead Sea. Everything flows into it, and guess what? Nothing flows out. Because it's so low. It accumulates minerals, salt. It's almost 10 times saltier than the oceans. It's dead because all it does is take in. You have to give out. You have to pour out for others. You have to live your life focused on not just receiving. If you do, you're going to die. You're going to die spiritually, you're going to die emotionally, You're going to die relationally. If all your focus is upon what you can get out of the deal, the end of that attitude is death. Who is it in your life? Who is it that God has placed in your life? Who is it that God is calling you to pour your life into? If you don't know of anyone now, I suggest probably because you're not looking or listening.
Yep.
We have to pour out our lives for others. As the Jesuits' motto, a man for others. We have to have a life focused on giving.
Amen.
And you know what? It's interesting that at our lowest times is when we are most needful to give out. It's at our lowest times that is the most beneficial for us to get out of ourselves and pour out our lives for others. To find somebody to serve. The best time to give, the best time to show God's love. J.D. Salinger's first book, his third book was entitled Franny and Zooey. It was written in 1961. And there's a scene in the book in which Franny, a 20-year-old theology major, has just come home from college for a long weekend. She's a nervous wreck. Her concerned mother, Bessie Glass, by the way, is her last name. Probably no relationship. Brings her a cup of chicken soup. Franny, unhappy, impatient, depressed, pushes the steaming cup of soup away, and Franny's brother Zooey sees this rejection and he becomes indignant. I'll tell you one thing, Franny, he says. If it's religious life you're studying, you ought to know that you're missing out on every single religious action that's going on in this house. You didn't have enough sense to drink a cup of consecrated chicken soup, which is the only kind of chicken soup that Mom ever brings to us. What was Franny missing? Well, she didn't see that the kitchen was the church. She didn't see or recognize her mother as being a priest. She didn't understand the soup was sacramental, that there was more into it, more to it than just soup. She missed the pouring out of the soup as the healing process that God was making available to her. Mom's chicken soup is poured out as a sacrament to soothe the soul and to squash the queasiness of her depressed daughter. Because Mom did it with all the intent of love and service and giving. When that first cup of wine was poured out at the wedding in Cana, was offered to the steward of the banquet, the wedding feast was transformed. The wedding feast was totally transformed. Instead of running out of wine, it was suddenly obvious that there was a vast amount. What? 150, 180 gallons? An untapped abundance. An overabundance of the very best wine available. All it took was pouring out that first cup for the floodgates to open. Yes. All it took was to pouring out that first cup for the water jars to become goblets full of wine for everyone. How willing are we to pour out that first cup of our lives? How willing are we to take that first step? To be the one that says, I'm sorry. To be the one that extends the hand of reconciliation. To be the one that hugs the hurting. November 2009 marked the 20th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down. To commemorate the event, all over Germany, small villages and cities, big cities, built their own recreations of that hated wall. Their celebrations were inspired by the reenactment of the collapse of the wall, at the original wall. 1,000 polystyrene blocks of mock wall were set up like gigantic dominoes along the central stretch of the old border between East and West Berlin. 1,000 blocks like dominoes. And when the moment came, Nobel Peace Prize winner Lech Walesa, everybody remember Walesa? Gave the first push. Walesa is a devout Roman Catholic who himself gives credit to the Polish shipyards and the Polish Pope John Paul II for the fall of the wall. He was the leader of the Polish labor union Solidarity, whose protests and human rights demands widened the cracks in communism's foundation. Walesa pushed the first domino at that mock wall, and his single action started the chain reaction. The domino effect had continued until the entire edifice was collapsed. One eyewitness wrote this: all over the city, smaller wall replicas had been put up in school playgrounds, parks. Children waited impatiently and at the signal rushed yelling to knock them over. It was all such a success that wall busting might become an annual festival. Invented tradition? Trivializing symbolism? No doubt. But is there a better way to synthesize the taste of sudden freedom than bashing down a barrier?
That's right.
Do you realize this morning that the first domino has already been pushed? Do you realize and understand that Christ has toppled the wall of sin and death? Do you see the walls falling in your own lives? Do you also know that the last domino has been guaranteed to fall? It will fall obediently flat. Why? Because Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. We do indeed live in a broken world amongst broken people. The sign of brokenness oftentimes are walls that separate people from people, that separate people from God. Loved ones, your calling, my calling, what all of us are called by God to do is to live our lives as He did, to love as He loved, to jump into the middle of that domino chain reaction, and to add our presence and our push to God's wall-busting mission. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Let's go ahead and receive our offering.